Hello and welcome to the SprocketPod. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cameron Collins. I am a revenue operations strategist with RevPartners, and I am the community manager with Sprocketeer, the largest independent community for HubSpot admin. I've got my co-host Mark Lerner here. Mark, go ahead and say hey to everyone.
What's everybody? Mark Lerner, Director of Growth Marketing at DealHub. We are a scalable, easier CPQ, native integrations with CRMs like HubSpot, and a happy co-host of the SprocketPod.
And we've got our guest today, William Gilchrist. Will, go ahead and say hey. Tell everyone a little bit about you and Konsyg.
How you guys doing? William Gilchrist from Konsyg, headquartered in Singapore. We are a end-to-end sales and service company, aka sales mercenaries. So we like to hit revenue targets for any large, medium, or small business anywhere in the world. We're your floating sales department.
Floating.
I love that because this is taking me back to my days, the bulk of my career, which was built in sales. And for those who have been in sales, it's not always the easiest of careers. So I'm curious, Will. I know that we talked a little bit on your podcast, the Consig Fireside Chat. But for those who are tuning in for the first time and hearing about you from the Sprocket Pod, how did you get to where you are in your career, and how did sales end up being the siren call that it was for you?
Long story, but the abridged version is that nobody goes to school. There's no degree in sales. Like, you're not saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to go get a degree and be a salesperson in my life. The opinion is that salespeople are trying to get over or try to like get some money out of you kind of thing. So it's not really a profession that you own, which is why even on my profiles, I always say salesperson. So how I actually got here was I was an international relations major coming out of Bowdoin College in the States, and then ended up getting a grad degree out of Cornell and Beijing University. So I got my master's in Chinese. And when you have a liberal arts undergrad and a language grad degree, well, there's two decisions. You got to go get something else that actually matters, or you can go be a spy for the government or something, right?
Or a professor in another college, like the University Industrial Complex.
Yeah, something, right? Usually people in that position end up falling into sales because it's not like I'm particularly a marketer. I'm not a plumber. I'm not an engineer. I ended up in actually sales. So my first sales role was actually being director of admissions of my old high school in Chicago. And I was selling pretty much a very expensive high school education to an all boys school when there was a free charter school right next door. So that was a really interesting sales pitch. So you had to sell a lot of grandmas and traditions, stuff like that. Then I had a bit of a taste for it, but I had already lived in Asia for a really long time at that time. And I was back in the States. So I didn't really want to be home. I had international relations, all that stuff. So I ended up leaving that role and taking an unpaid internship for a company called TSL Marketing in Singapore. And that was actually a lead generation company, is a lead generation company. And at the time we were working with large corporations. So I was a cold caller and an intern cold caller. That was where I started. And I always feel like that was the hardest yet most important piece of my career. And that's what kind of led me to Google. It led me to startups and things like that as director of sales. And then eventually realizing that everybody's sales systems and structures are extremely flawed, and they might have some issues, ego issues, personnel issues, structural process issues. And I just saw this, it didn't matter what company it was. If it was a large recognizable company or if it was a startup, they had the same issues. So that's how Konsyg came about, effectively what it is.
That reminds me very much of many points through my journey, deciding that I was going to take a career in sales as well, and selling everything from timeshare vacation packages to marketing services. And being on the revenue operations side is really interesting now because it's more the operations piece of things. One thing that I'm really curious to get your take on, and we'll talk a little bit about like the ethics of sales and some of the maybe more or less ethical things to do. But one of the concepts that has always been a recurring theme for me, at least throughout my career, is whether or not anyone and everyone is a buyer.
Hmm.
And you've got these two people on either end of the spectrum with Grant Cardone and Jordan Belfort. They did that infamous interview many years back, really covering this topic. But curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is everyone indeed a buyer?
Most people are not. a buyer. And I think as soon as salespeople understand that, one, it'll do better to the trade and the label of salespeople, because salespeople that are walking around believing that everybody is a buyer, that's the reason why you get bad sales, overselling, deceit, and all those terrible things in sales. But if you walk in believing that most people aren't, you actually become more of a doctor, and you are diagnosing and creating a diagnosis to be able to prescribe a medicine, which is your product. Right. So if I feel like if more salespeople walked around seeing themselves as potential doctors, and well, not everybody is a patient, right? The same way not everybody is a buyer. So the always be selling ABC, Glenn Glary, Glenn Ross stuff, Wolf of Wall Street stuff, it's really good for the movies. It's amazing for the movies. I love watching it too. I laugh. But most of the time when you see those things, they're really horrible and heinous tactics. For Wall Street, they ended up in jail. Boiler Room, that was a scandal. Glengarry Glen Ross, that didn't really work out very well. So when you really look at some of these influences where people kind of typecast salespeople, you really look at the whole story, not the fun stuff. Well, those people didn't really last very long. So no, most people are not buyers, and you'll get a lot better sales if you realize that.
Yeah, I got to agree with that. I had actually a very similar first sales role to you, William. I worked as an admissions advisor to an online university that shall remain unnamed, but selling incredibly expensive private university to just about anybody. Hey, you'll get free money from the government. And we know how that's what's happened with folks with those loans going forward. And very quickly realized some of the unethical things. And this was a very respected company. And it was very much everyone's a buyer. It doesn't matter. Oh, you don't have a high school degree? We'll still figure out how to get you into this college. And it actually burned me out. And I like you, I had a liberal degree in psychology, which obviously wasn't going to use. And I actually left that job and went to business school because I felt this is not the way for me. But since then, I've obviously met salespeople that have a very different philosophy. But it was, at least in that role, very much top down. There was no discerning if they're a buyer or not. Everyone's a buyer. And I think that was a pretty negative thing for that company and the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. I think that if everybody is a buyer, that just even the premise, right, it already should raise some red flags, because it's pretty much saying do something to make them a buyer. That's really what that is saying. And that's terrifying. Do whatever you can to get them in, even if it means slashing your prices and things like that. And even that has its own issues, right? If you're saying, fine, I'm going to give you a free 6 months, you're doing that because you're still going to charge them eventually. So why not just be completely honest and not give a mystification of free? You can give benefits and incentives and things like that. But it just leads to so many different avenues in terms of how it's sold, what is sold. Are you really positioning a value prop? Are you really pricing it fairly? Are you really telling the truth on its value? Are you actually standing for something? So many salespeople actually don't stand for things because they believe everybody's a buyer. Thus, a lot of products get disrespected and they don't make it. They don't really go the distance. They don't make it the long haul as salespeople or as products.
There's a basic principle in economics, which is that demand creates supply, not the other way around. And I don't think I ever really understood what that meant until I would be in sales and I have something for you and people don't want it. And to your point, I could slash the price and maybe that gets them across the finish line, but that doesn't really create a bona fide buyer. It might get you a sale, but it's not what creates the buyer. And so the reality is that the demand creates the supply, and that's what sets the price. And if we flip it and start looking at some of the ethical or unethical ways of selling, I want to start with the one call close because I know there's a lot of companies that still utilize it. And I did it for many years with various products that I've sold. Do either of you think that there's still a place in this world for the one call close with salespeople, or is that outdated?
I have a video on YouTube that literally is titled "The One Call Close Doesn't Exist." So that's why I was like laughing just now. I'm like, the one call close. I think that it can exist, but is it a sell? Yeah, you can get someone to purchase an item through a one call close, right? But do you really have a customer? Do you really have a client, for instance? Yeah, I've sold deals from one call, but I can probably really think on the top of my head how those all went down the road, maybe 2, 3 months later, or maybe even a few hours later. We all know what buyer's remorse is, but then we all, at the same time, talk about one call closes in narratives. That in itself combats, right? It's like we have to also be able, as salespeople, to be able to get in front of potential buyer's remorse by really giving time to be able to get the real pain points out there, the real value prop out there, really attaching it, and actually getting somebody to take action and be motivated to stay with. So that would be my position on it. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts on it, because one, we're now in a time where I think the idea of close, it's all about getting that new, I had a light here and it seems to not want to be going anymore. Okay. The idea of just close doesn't matter. We're just looking at that net new. We're actually, I think, past that point, at least in the B2B space that I exist in. The idea of getting a customer that has a high lifetime value as being the metric to look at is much more well known. If you're a sales rep that's closing and then those people are either not renewing or maintaining a very low contract or whatever, I think that's no longer good enough in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, I think that's going to help with some of the negative behavior. On the other hand, we have buyers, B2B buyers, that are much more self-led, meaning many of them have done all of this work, research, before they end up talking to a sales rep. And some of them might just be like, yeah, I'm ready. Let's go. I've already looked at everything else. Like I'm fully educated. Again, I'm not on the front lines of sales anymore, so I don't know, but I'm just observing that a lot of the times a buyer comes in and they have been doing their research for months and they know what they want. So I'm of those two minds right now, but I don't know if there's such thing as a one call close in practice.
I think to the points that William had mentioned a few moments ago here, where renewals had been mentioned up, and Mark, you've talked about as well, will that be a happy customer and a long-term customer? And on this show, we've talked a few times about data modeling and what we would call the bow tie data model created by Winning by Design. But if we think about the one call close, that might get new sales in what I would call the left side of the bow tie. So it gets a deal in the door, it closes some revenue. But if that person is not renewing, if they're not purchasing more and you're not getting up sales or cross sales, then again, the right side of the bow tie, what happens after the initial transaction, that's what's being missed. And revenue operations, I would define it as the science of sustainable revenue growth, right? So if you don't have sustainable revenue growth, then you don't have good revenue operations. So just taking it back, in my opinion, is the one call close a way to get net new revenue? It can be. It probably is, to what Will said earlier, trying to make everyone a buyer when maybe they shouldn't all be. But it's not, in my opinion, a great way of getting long-term sustainable revenue for growth and scale, which is really what every business wants.
No, absolutely. And I think that even as Mark was mentioning, the people who come in, they're the self-starters, they're the people who, okay, I know everything, I've done a lot of research and all that. Even then, I still don't allow it to be a one call close, even if they're coming in ordering up the menu. Because I have seen people that will love you fast and hate you just faster, right? This is amazing. It's everything I want. I've done all this research. I know everything about it and all that stuff. And then 2 weeks later, their expectations were way over here, where honestly the realities of life or the realities of sales or the realities of the market are actually over here. They probably didn't consider that. So a lot of people who come in and kick in the door and say, I know everything, I see that also as a potential one call close issue. And how often do salespeople say, okay, I get that you like this, but why? What happens if nothing happens? I love that question for people who are extremely willing to move forward. What happens in 3 weeks if you got zero revenue? What if no deals happened in the next 2 months? What do you think went wrong? Is it the sales? Is it the product? Is it the market? How do you process nothing in 3 weeks or in 6 weeks? And they usually get very surprised by those questions because I'm trying to give them like an Armageddon example just to see where their expectations are, right? And it's fascinating because that question usually exposes where their mind is. No, well, we should absolutely be able to have at least $10 million of revenue in 3 weeks. No. That's that. Now I know why you're so excited. Now I know your motivations for moving forward, or now I know why you want to move right to the next step after the first call, because maybe your expectations are not really aligned with the realities of whether how sales works or how revenue is generated in your business. These things usually need to be qualified a bit more before taking somebody on as a client so that they can stay, because that's really what people should be looking at, not the initial transaction, it's the follow-ups.
And so when it comes to good sales practice, and we'll talk a little bit about pressure, objections, rebuttals again in a few moments here, but there's obviously ethical ways of going about being a sales professional, and then there's unethical. Lying would be an obviously unethical thing to do, but I've seen some successful sales reps that have put a lot of effort into their craft, and what they would call market research, some would call being dirty. An example would be a sales rep who goes to a competitor, fills out a demo form, poses as a customer, and goes through the process so they can see all the A to Z of how the competitor is working. And I'm curious, Will, if that's something that you would advocate for, or if you think it's something that is maybe not very tactful.
That's a tricky one. That exact example is a tricky one because are we calling it unethical to do reconnaissance? It happens to us all the time. So that's where my smirk is coming from, is that we get a ton of people that have gone through our process and their proposals look like ours, the some of the terminologies and some of the things that you would only know if you were to go through the process with us, they end up on their website and things like that. So I've been a victim of that. Konsyg doesn't actually do that per se, but I don't know how I would react if somebody wanted to understand someone else's systems. I think it's what you do with it thereafter. That's where the ethics comes in. Knowing how somebody else operates is one thing. Stealing their methodologies and their entire systems to be able to apply it to yours, that's where the ethics comes in, right? It's what are your motivations? Reconnaissance, I think, is fair. I'm able to look, I can see. Would I go in and pose the client? I think that scratches on a little bit of dishonesty, and I'm really anti lying in this business because people assume salespeople are liars anyway. So I try to be like, look, okay, everybody already thinks that we're like liars, so we might as well just be really focused on like not lying. So that's the only trigger point. But other than that, I think if you're just understanding how people operate, it's all about what you're doing with that information. If it's to push them out of the market, I think that's also a bit weird because I think competition should not be intentional or with intention to destroy another company. It should be, no, we want to be as they say in Chicago, we want to be the flyest ones, right? I like that you're there, but our stuff is flyer, right? It looks way better. It's all that, but it's not based off of you. This is just, we do something different. We do something potentially better than you, right? But it's not off the back of you kind of thing. That's how I would probably address something like that.
Yeah, ethics, it's questionable. Listen, there's nothing proprietary about the way your pricing is or your proposals, whatever. There's nothing illegal about it. From a marketing perspective, marketers look at other people's, the way they present their companies and their branding and their positioning all the time. That is part of the job, right? You look at the competitors, you look at people in your space. How are they describing their features and benefits? This is just part of the game. Everybody does it. If your main competitive advantage, the thing that sets you apart, is something in your sales process and that someone copies it and that is what kills you, then I think that's probably a bigger problem. I think it happens. I've never done it, but I know people that do. And I think that on the other side, the company you're trying to mislead, the onus is on them to figure it out. I think it's relatively easy to spot one of these things and just not take the call. So yeah, I think doing reconnaissance, like you said, is incumbent. Doing it in that way is probably not the best way to do it. There are other ways to do it. You got to learn from everybody. You have to understand the space. You have to see how the others are talking about their product and service, how they're positioning it, what their approach is. Take a little bit from this, take a little bit from that, but make it your own. Or else if you just do a carbon copy, I don't think it's really going to do much anyways.
To your point, if viewing someone else's sales tactics are what makes or breaks your business, it's probably not a great thing.
Exactly.
And the performers and the reps that I've seen who have done this extremely successfully, who are top performers at their organizations, they do it specifically with the intent of, I want to get an idea of what the other guy is saying. Is he going to talk smack about my company? Is he going to lie outright and embellish what their company does? And so it was done specifically with the purpose of, I want to be able to handle objections. So if a customer says, well, I'm looking at these guys, I know how to address that
Absolutely.
and do tact.
Absolutely. In fact, I have a real-time example of that. Exactly that. A few months ago, we're working in a weird space because we're actually not competitors of the companies that people think that we're competing against, because there isn't an end-to-end sales as a service company. Sales fully. They might be using the same words, but no one's actually closing business for other businesses. It's always leads, qualified leads, things like that, like the kind of the business development part of things. So sometimes we get blurred together. But I was looking at a competitor's website, and the things that they were promising, you wouldn't believe. Free 1 month, 25 qualified opportunities with a 10% conversion rate in the first 30 days sign up. Now, first off, it's free, so no one's really going to complain. No one's going to leave a negative review. But just putting that out there on your website, that's really tough when I have to go in with a new, prospect or a new potential client, and they're looking at this and then saying, look, they're guaranteeing all these opportunities in the first 30 days. And I'm saying, do the math on that. That's one deal a day. There's only 20 business days in a month. Does that even make sense to you when you do the math? So those things happen all the time. And I think that's where the reconnaissance comes in. It wasn't until I went and looked at that I started to see what was going on in the market. But I wouldn't go and look at that and then say, okay, look, on our side, we need to say a free 2 months with 80. That would be a bit insane. So I think that, it can allow you to have a little bit more perspective in terms of where you are on the spectrum in terms of quality.
And to that point, what you want to avoid in sales is the race to the bottom.
Yeah.
You don't want to be just the cheapest. Some companies want to be the cheapest guy on the block, but in general, as a sales rep, you don't want that to be your MO. I'm just going out and I'm giving the lowest price. I'm being the cheapest person or whatever, right? Like you want to be able to, at least for me, go to sleep knowing you're doing your profession and you're doing it well. And that was something that was always important. When it comes to the sales process, so we've talked about how people are more informed now and they may buy something impulsively or quickly. They may have done research before. As a sales rep, you've even spoken to somebody. But let's talk a little bit about the different types of sales motion. So the two standard ones are inbound and outbound. We have all bound, which is emerging. And I'm curious, before we go any further, Will, if you're familiar with all bound as a sales motion or go to market motion, and if this is something that's growing as more of the talk of the town nowadays.
Will's reaction speaks volumes.
Yeah.
I think it's a fun word, like disrupt and revolutionize and all of those funny words. I think that type of terminology is not going to have legs for very long because it's physics. There's in or out opportunities. I think the all bound thing.
It's both.
Yeah, yeah. It's another. It's there. There's just. I'm familiar with it. I'm so not a believer in some of these terms that it's hard for me to take them seriously. I'm more than willing to get into it, but it's more like all bound. Okay, that means what was the first point of contact? And if the first point of contact was through an outreach, then that technically is outbound. If it was through someone waking up one day saying, gee, I think I want to call Konsyg, that's an inbound. Allbound, I don't know, it might be voodoo or some kind of a mystic spell that I put on them and say, think about me. And even then, that would be outbound. So I don't know.
So here's the question, because I've thought about this a lot. I think the all-bound thing, Cameron and I stumbled on it once during a show when we argued about if it was like a legit thing. To me, it sounds like a branding. Someone's trying to brand a term and then position their service as that. This kind of binary inbound, outbound is interesting because one of the motions that I'm seeing a lot now is customer advocacy. So leveraging your existing customers to advocate on your behalf within communities, social, in person, whatever. Is that the first point of contact is then somebody hearing about your company through one of your existing customers? How does that fall between this inbound, outbound space?
That's interesting because like you're referring to clutch, things like that, right?
That, and also things like, one of the things I do is I have my eyes on, let's say, the communities that people exist in on Slack and as well as on LinkedIn. Someone asks a question, hey, do you have any suggestions about this kind of service? And I have a group of existing customers that are more than happy to give a good word. And I'll reach out to them and say, hey, do you mind jumping in here? And they will, and then we'll get an inbound lead. How do you mark that lead? So,
inbound.
Yeah. Okay.
You said it too, because it's
right.
marketing.
But their first point of contact wasn't that they just up and decided. So we had marshaled external resources to help influence their decision.
Now that's interesting. Okay. So in the event that I feel like if there's a referral, that's an inbound lead because that person's like your marketing, your billboard, right? Your advocate. Yeah. If it's been almost an intentional one, which is more like your G2 and clutch, which is go on here specifically, that's still marketing, right? Like I think I would consider that more like a marketing qualified lead. It's just not outbound or inbound marketing, maybe, right? Maybe an inbound marketing tool is a website or a G2, a clutch, or your home site and things like that. And maybe some of your marketing materials that are out there, right? That might be a little bit more of an inbound market. Outbound marketing might be straight up ads, right? Like targeted advertisements on YouTube and things like that. And maybe whatever, Super Bowl halftime ad or something like that. I would say that's more like marketing people trying to go out there. But at the end of the day, anything that's coming from marketing has to be inbound, and outbound has to be an actual either sales rep or a person within the company who's actively pursuing a particular book of business to try to convert them to be soon to be customers. That's just how I see it. I'm open down the road for some other way of doing that.
Yeah, I think to me, allbound is just another way to say that everyone is doing their job and attribution is working well. Because I think it probably was created by companies like Clay or other SaaS companies that want to say, are you practicing allbound? Are you nurturing your contacts? But in reality, what it is, inbound and outbound working harmoniously to make sure that deals are happening. And at the same time, marketing attribution is happening. So, to your example, in my opinion, when it comes to you're talking to somebody, you're a customer and you're talking to somebody and you tell that person to go sign up for Konsyg, that's still now an inbound customer that is also a referral. And so you would want them to be tagged as an inbound as the source. You would want them to be marked as a referral. You would want to know who the referral was, and then you're going to have maybe a sales rep who calls them back and signs them up. So there can be an outbound conversation. Source was inbound.
Exactly. 100%. I find that really interesting. I have to look deeper into allbound now that it's come up because I'm like, when I first saw it, I was like, okay, no, I just can't. There's no way.
Yeah, I think that as a sales professional, ultimately, the notion of, for example, building your brand and using that to attract people, I think that's an important thing. I think it's something salespeople should leverage. And I think that it can play into the greater go to market motions of a company, right? Because if you're a sales rep and you have somebody that reaches out and says, hey, I'm curious about who you are and what you do, that's still an inbound person. And I don't think that necessarily calling all bound its own motion necessarily warrants blending the two. At the end of the day, the source needs to be one or the other. Did the sales rep go out and get the lead and the contact, or did the person initiate and come in? Caveat, there's all kinds of dark funnel stuff that we'll never know. You're a sales rep, you call somebody, you start having a conversation, and you find out 6 months down the road that they had looked at your website before you ever spoke to them. Right. Now
Oh,
we start to blur the lines of attribution, but I still think that would be an outbound.
Of course. And as an outbound bias person, somebody were to say, that's actually inbound, it's what converted them. So that's how I would look at it. Look, it was my phone call that actually got the conversation going. Really appreciate the brand recognition that everything else where they've gone to the website. But at the end of the day, they weren't buying when they looked at the website. They were buying when they were talking to me on the phone. Outbound sell, you know.
And I would add one more nuance that a business should define their philosophy and then set that. So a company might say, we actually would consider that inbound or outbound, right? And fine, but write the rules and plug it into the CRM so that there's no ambiguity, because it's not both.
Well, large corporations and actually a lot of the reason why Konsyg exists, because this that we're describing actually is done really poorly in companies, right? You can have the top sales rep of the year who generated $35 million worth of sales revenue that year, but it was all through an inbound opportunity because they were in a channel, right? They had Center Manhattan, New York during New Year's, selling plastic cups, right? So everybody's going to call you at that time. But the same plastic cup company where you have the outbound seller going out to Yuma, Arizona, right? Same time frame. They're calling in the Yuma, Arizona, trying to sell plastic cups. Nobody cares. But the plastic cup channel in central Manhattan got $35 million. And suddenly that particular person who didn't do a single cold call is the big salesperson of the year, right? That doesn't mean that they're not. That classification usually isn't clearly defined. What did they really need to do? Were they selling or were they just available to take an order? So that also is a big issue in sales organizations that I've seen. I've also experienced it. And that's something that from a process perspective, not only the definition of inbound, outbound, but also how it's interpreted is also a big issue in these companies as well.
Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, it seems like I've always found it to be like a very academic argument, and one that is, I understand why it's needed, right? Especially as a bigger company, you need to be able to attribute the win to, but it creates this tension between, let's say, marketing and sales in particular, that I think is often counterproductive. And then you have all sorts of nasty stuff that can happen about messing with stuff. And I think when it gets to that point, it's actually negative for the business. And so I would hope that there is some format that could be used that gives everybody gets credit, right? Like the salesperson talked to them and that obviously closed the sale, but would the sale have closed had they not visited the website? Maybe there's attribution to go around to everyone. And it shouldn't be this kind of Hunger Games kind of thing about arguing over who gets attribution, because I think it's just counterproductive to everything and creates this internal tension that probably shouldn't exist. But I know that it is what it is and it happens. So luckily the role I have today doesn't, like, I don't have to get into the muck around that stuff, which I'm grateful for. But yeah, that's where I stand on it.
Well, I think a lot of that too is not the rep's fault, and I don't think it's the executive's fault. It's middle management.
It's marketing's fault.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, but no, that sounds too biased. But no, I think it's middle management fault on the marketing and sales side. One of the biggest issues I think in revenue generation and in sales process, whether that be the marketing processes in terms of how it feeds into sales or just the sales process in general, is actually middle managers. Those individuals, either they have never, let's say from the sales side, either they've never actually sold before, Most middle managers have never actually done a cold call before. They've just been in a company hanging around enough, or maybe they were on a really good channel and then they were able to get some deals in. And then as a result of that, they just survived. Thus, they're a manager of the sales team, but they probably haven't actually done the work themselves from a cold calling perspective, or really haven't do any real outbound sales. Or maybe they're that person who had the Cup channel in Central Manhattan. That becomes your next manager. So that in itself is usually where the gap is, because they're not setting the definitions. They're not giving the right recognitions. They're not structuring the sales organization or the organization of revenue generation within the company in a manner that is conducive to that collaboration between sales and marketing, right? These people are incentivized this way. This group is incentivized another way. As a result of that, the two managers they're working together because they're just trying to survive as they do. And then under that becomes this thing of, no, that's my deal. No, that's my deal. Or, no, this was the source. That was the source. Or this is tagged improperly. And I think if I were to say who the culprit is, it is middle management, pretty much.
I think we can all focus our anger on middle management. And
yes.
Yeah, I agree.
It's RevOps' fault. But in all seriousness, that it actually brings up an interesting point where we talk about how oftentimes it becomes a sales versus marketing conundrum, and then it becomes sales versus service on the quality of the sale. And I think this is where it's really important for companies that are established to have someone in the revenue operations role who is really an unbiased advocate for all of the parties. Because even when you look at the executive team, right? So if we look at any organization top down, you have the executive team with VPs or C levels executives who are going to be advocating for their goals. So VP of sales wants to drive sales, VP of marketing wants to improve marketing. And then you've got your middle managers and then you've got your reps. The reps just want to get their paychecks, right? They want to make as much as they can, understandably. And then middle managers want to hit their KPIs. And having somebody in revenue operations helps to really act as a bridge between all of these teams and roles. And you get the unbiased perspective where someone can say, let's document rules and processes. And I think not having everything documented and not having everything down to a process or a formula, that is oftentimes an argument now between sales, marketing, service, right? So to that point, let's talk data entry.
Fun.
Will, how do you feel about sales reps and their responsibility for CRM data entry?
My nickname when I was working in large corporate was Salesforce, because I was bad at it. Bad at it because I think the sales personality and data entry and CRMing, look, you hired a personality to go out there to close deals. Sometimes filing them, and they're quick, they're on the move, they're not really sleeping much, they're probably drinking a lot of coffee, they're always in every dinner, every cafe, every networking event. You know, when you get back and you're exhausted, sometimes it's tough to update what's going on in your CRM, and that kind of like snowballs, right? So I don't have a leg to stand on here. That's why I'm giving you a bit of background that I was a terrible data entry person, and I've become the person who's forcing my reps to do data entry significantly. However, in my defense, when I structured this business, I knew who I was and how bad I was. Thus, I have a department just to do the CRM portion for all the sales reps. Thus, our sales reps actually don't have to do any CRMing at all. We have a department dedicated to that. Why? Because I sucked at it. So I'm well aware. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not going to talk to a sales rep and say, why didn't you file that? Don't worry, we have it all there. So then we're able to update it. So I'm well aware that sales reps aren't that good at that. I too am guilty of it. I'll put that out there.
I think that, to your credit, that is a luxury that probably any salesperson would dream of and kill for. I don't know if you're hiring, but if you're not, I'm sure you're going to have a bunch of people that want to work at Konsyg now.
How you felt is why
because-
I did it. I was like, imagine if we just removed the CRM problem. And I'm like, every salesperson, I'm like, exactly.
And the next best thing then for a company that doesn't have someone dedicated to help with data entry is
AI.
leveraging resources. So that might be third party apps. As we know from our co host Mark here, you can use something like DealHub, for example, to help with CPQ setup. But even going insofar as something like Avoma, where if you're on a phone call, it might be with their enterprise plan, but I know they have the capability to take note summaries and plug it right into the CRM. And then there's other apps that can analyze phone calls and fill out properties. You get a name, an address, key talking points, all of that has notes that are logged, all of that has properties that are filled out. And obviously, these are not free resources. When you think about growing and scaling an organization, the efficiency of your sales reps is super important. And so I think it is important that companies consider their tech stack where they can help sales reps to be more efficient.
Yeah, I actually think, and this is just conjecture, this is going to be a built-in feature of HubSpot, I think, at least on the enterprise side soon, right? It's not anything crazy. This is like a very simple AI use case. Record the call, which record it is, fill in the fields based on the conversation. They're already working on AI in the background. This just seems, and Gong does a great job at this, but it is not proprietary. It's like a very obvious AI use case. And so I think this is the days of sales reps having to manually fill in these fields, I think, are numbered, in my opinion. And
Yeah,
I'm just dropping that in the middle of the floor and let you guys do with that what you want.
I think that would be awesome. I wouldn't be surprised if we get an announcement about this at Inbound, or if anybody who will be there does reconnaissance and notices any product managers who want to spill the tea. We'd love to know if this feature is coming, because that would be a real game changer. And ultimately, really, if we boil it down, what this comes down to is the fact that companies need data to be entered, but you don't want to be burdening your reps. And so there's got to be a fine line of using tools and resources, but also sales reps do need to be responsible, right? So you can't just have a call, not let it be recorded, put in zero properties, zero notes, zero info, and then expect that if it's a game of he said, she said, you're going to win, right? As we would always say, cover your ass. And so
But
that's where note taking helps.
But my defense was always, I'm much better now, guys. This is horrible for my brand, but I'm much better now. But what about the rep that goes in, plugs in the name, the date, the closing revenue, and then the receipt, the actual signed contract? I think that's good. No, totally joking.
That counts for something, right? But also, what if they don't put in the signed contract and they just say it
yes.
was $100,000? That's not
Yes,
good.
I think my sales brothers and sisters are going to be really good about like showing the proof of the purchase, but maybe all the details in terms of how we got there, it's a little weird.
Yeah.
Let's take this to then the next logical conclusion, which is how sales reps can really elevate themselves in their profession. So obviously, there's just being mindful about data entry is something that helps you just professionally to look good. With that being said, though, there's a million other ways that you can benefit your career, ranging from sales trainings, online courses. Curious, Will, what some of the things are that you suggest reps tap into to just better themselves on a regular basis and grow their career?
Yeah, one, I think understanding kind of your own voice. So listening to maybe colleagues and things like that, their particular calls, and see how they are interacting, but not really necessarily borrowing the pieces, really just seeing where your voice is, right? Like how do you socialize? How do you laugh? What is your actual knowing yourself? And then that way, when you go into sales trainings or methodologies, I'm Sandler sales certified, right? I did the Sandler courses, and 2.5 years I sat in class for Sandler and all that stuff. But ultimately, it wouldn't have helped me at all if I didn't have like my own context in terms of who I wanted to be and how I wanted to sell and how I wanted to go about doing things. And then from there, when you're engaging content like LinkedIn Learning, you're looking at, let's say, YouTube trainings, but also at the same time, getting mentors, getting like sales mentors, people, even from the old school, like 80s type salespeople. Those are actually really good because those are the foundations of what we have today. I am petrified of people who look at blogs And it's like the 5 best sales tactics. Like that is terrifying, right? It's absolutely terrifying because what it does is it gives a cliche version of a martial art, right? Sales is a martial art that you need to train and you need to practice and you need to refine ongoing. And sometimes you just don't win certain matches, and other times you're winning for a while, then you lose another one, and then this tactic didn't work anymore, but has been working the year before. So all that comes from seeing it as a practice or a more of an art form that's contextualized to who you are versus listening to one channel or one other channel that will just give you what the answers are and how to sell.
I think people think it's similar to the Matrix, where Neo just gets the martial arts downloaded, and all of a sudden he's a master at it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work like that.
One day.
Some people have a we're not far off maybe from AI
No.
just running the show. Which, let's talk about that quickly. Then I'm curious, Will, your thoughts on AI driving sales. We know it's helpful for sales reps to have intelligence and information at their fingertips, but how far do you think we can push the boundaries? Will we get to a point where AI bots are making phone calls that sound real enough, or are meetings real enough to actually close deals? Or is that a world that you don't think we're going to be approaching?
1 month ago, I didn't think so. Now I'm starting to think so.
What
But
changed? What changed it? What kind of epiphany did you have?
a lot of things that a lot of things that I've seen in a lot of technologies that are being developed. But I think that the thing, which I think eventually it'll get there, but the thing is that who is building the AI algorithms and where is it learning from? Is it learning from listening to calls, a bunch of calls over time and trying to figure it out? That's going to miss the spirit molecule of it. It's all about how many people are actually training it who are actual salespeople, because it can pick up on the fact that I use instead of an, or I stuttered there, or I told a joke here and there. But you can't really put a mathematical equation behind a sales call. There's a lot to it. And when you get into that, there is a bit of what I call like a spirit molecule, right? This is the human interaction piece. That's the one thing it hasn't quite figured out. Go on to ChatGPT and ask it to write an email. It's going to start with, I hope this email finds you well in good spirits. Every evolving landscape, pivotal, crucial. This is critical, right? Like all of those, like it's obvious. Revolutionary, right? And all those phrases are just there because it's running a certain kind of set of ways of writing an email because it's based on something. And yes, it's learning, it's growing, it's getting better, but it's not the spirit molecule of somebody actually writing an email with the natural errors of things, with the natural misspellings, with the natural, oh man, that font wasn't the same as that font. There's something about those type of emails that still resonate with people. The same is going to be for whatever the Skynet salespeople that are going to be out there in the Terminator days or something. I don't know. But I think that it's whoever's programming it, whoever's teaching it is going to also need to showcase that they've done sales for a very long time. So that would be, I think, the ultimate answer so that it actually has a real vibe. But I don't think we're too far away from that being a possibility.
When you take that to its logical conclusion, we're going towards a world where you're just going to have AI selling to AI, right? There's just going to be like an AI seller and AI buyer, and they're just going to optimize to sell to each other. I don't know. That's a very weird concept to me. I don't think it's close by, but that's a logical end state. If we start having AI selling, we're going to have AI buyers, and it's just going to be algorithms fighting each other.
Not a bad idea to make an AI brokerage, right? Two companies load their ICP profiles and all the details and all the banking info, and then you have
and then humans just become the
brokering
energy for the robots to feed off of our body.
That's it.
That's kind of like the Matrix.
Where I was going.
Yeah, that's right. And a moment of appreciation for ChatGPT's newest release. think it was last night, they released Strawberry, named so for the ongoing joke that it didn't know how many R's were in the word strawberry, and I guess now it
I
can
didn't
tell
know that
that.
little piece of that's funny. I didn't know that was the reason.
Yeah, there's videos about it, and it was probably a specific user giving specific prompts, but yeah, it was throwing some errors about there's two R's, and they're like, no, there's three R's, something like that. So yeah, I was only looking at the last two. So
Well,
all
because
of
it's
that
the
is
way
to
it
say,
breaks up words into tokens rather than like specific letters or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
so all of that is to say, AI is definitely getting more and more impressive. But when we think about breaking this into the world of sales, it is so important for sales reps to use all the resources at their fingertips. It really is not a game of sales versus marketing, but it is sales and marketing and service. The last question I've got for you, Will, is when it comes to sales reps and building an online profile, an online persona, a brand, what's your opinion? Necessary? Is it just a good thing to do? Do you require it?
No, I mean, I think that ultimately what's most important is how authentic everybody really is in their particular space, right? I'm a big fan of authenticity. So if something is going well, or if you're good at this particular thing, if you're not good at this particular thing, say it, right? And I think that kind of brings an element of truth, right? And how real are people being? Nothing's worse than the toting company line individuals and organizations that no matter what, this organization can never do no wrong kind of thing. I think that type of stuff can be extremely exhausting, and it stalls progress. So it kind of stunts the growth because no one's like having real conversations about it. So I'm much more about people being very authentic in terms of their positions in whatever department that they're in.
I think that's an interesting notion where it's good as an organization to encourage people to build their online presence and to build their social media profiles, but not necessarily to force it. At the same time, if that's something that a company requires, like we require our sales rep to be online and to have a social media presence, then that should be very clear and transparent as a part of the hiring process because there are a ton of sales reps that I know who are amazing, but would never, ever get on LinkedIn. And then I know some salespeople who are really great at what.
Yeah, I saw that too.
We lost you, Cameron.
Yeah, that happened to me actually with that last question. I was like a little lost in the question because I was like, wait,
All right. Well,
they do. Super.
oh, he's back. It's gonna be edited,
nope, we're live. This is live.
right?
We're just coming up on time. So let me take over for Cameron as look, he's glitched out here. So I think the question that he was coming to was about putting pressure on sales reps, if that was something that's
Yeah, from a social media kind of standpoint, like, look, I have seen a lot of people on LinkedIn, some at LinkedIn, that will literally go on there and it's this big brand and they're like, oh my God, like this is an amazing place. The company's like a family. I every time I wake up in the morning and eat my eggs and bacon, I put it in my company's logo. And then 2 weeks later, they moved on to another company. And then they're saying, oh, it's moments like these that matter most. When we're able to get with a new team. I've moved on from my previous role, and it was the most heartbreaking moment, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to do it. You see a lot of that stuff. That's why I'm always really big on the authenticity of
right.
how you position yourself.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Cameron's
I
back.
love it. There we go. The first time in almost a year of doing podcasts that my internet drops, but
It's all good. I picked up the baton and tried to run.
Response.
so all of the amazing talking points that we've had here, I want to wrap with this. There's the famous scene in Wolf of Wall Street where he goes, "Sell me this pen," and you never actually see him do it. And then in reality, he did interviews subsequently where he says, in actuality, the first thing I do is find out, do people need a pen? And if they
Yeah.
do, I'll sell them on it.
Yeah.
So if you want to sell us a pen,
Oh
Wow.
man.
On the spot. Excellent. So
or
what I
sell
would
us Konsyg,
well, I
maybe.
could very easily do the Konsyg sell, but I think that I never saw the interview where he said that. Do you need a pen? The reality is That's a very complicated sell these days because there are just so many pins out there, and there's not many opportunities where you're really going to need one these days. So you have to actually know what you're talking about. Let me try to give a better example that also will address the pinpoint. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Let's say that I was going to sell you this half drunk glass of water, for instance. I even put some apple cider vinegar in it. So it's here, right? It's right here. And I wanted to sell this to you. And you were going to pay me $1,000. You're going to wire it to me. Would you do that? That sounds insane, right? That's because you're sitting in an air-conditioned room. You have access to water. There are water faucets everywhere. You probably can even get ice. You can get frozen water if you want somewhere put into the water to be able to cool it down. Right? You have all this hydration sitting around. But if you were in the Sahara Desert for the last 2.5 days and you finally got to an edge and you saw me standing here with this apple cider vinegar half drunk glass of water, and I turned around and said, look, I don't want to do this to you, but it's got to be $1,000. That conversation changes, right? So selling you this pin is 100% depending on what your situation actually is. Are you someone who works a desk job who operates on the computer? Are you literate, right? I mean, do you even sign things? Do you have hands? There's a ton of things that go into trying to do something like just selling a pin. In order to actually sell it, you have to actually one, in the beginning of the conversation, just assume that not everybody's a buyer and that most people are not buyers. Chances are you don't need my pin, you don't want my pin, and you don't really care about my pin. If I go in thinking about that, then I can ask you questions to see whether or not you actually really wanted a pin. So that would be my response to that, because it's a little bit too hard to do it ad hoc.
Well, and it just goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the episode. Not everyone is always a buyer, and demand creates the supply. So if somebody doesn't need it, then you don't need to sell it to them. If they do need it, then you better be ready to handle some objections and rebuttals, because that's a whole nother ballgame.
Even deeper.
Well,
Sorry. I had to jump in on that last part, but if they do need it, the next step before jumping on it is, why do you need it? Right. And that allows them to be a real buyer, because now you understand their motivations, which you can remind them of ongoing and say, oh, remember, you said you needed this pen because you write on the side of your desk, you don't want to return it, right?
if it's an emotional sale, you can find out, hey, Will, you're a business guy. What's the biggest deal you've done? Oh, $1 million. Wow. Imagine if the next time you had a deal of that size, you had a Mont Blanc $500 pen. And then you start to play into the why and the who and all the details. But first, you got to find out, do they need it? Well, thank you for joining us today on today's episode of the Sprocket Pod. For those who aren't familiar, maybe you're listening on a platform like YouTube or Spotify, make sure you follow all of us on LinkedIn: Cameron Collins, Mark Lerner, William Gilchrist. If you're not already a member of the Sprocketeer group, make sure you check us out. We are on LinkedIn, but you can also join our Slack community. There's over 2,000 HubSpot admin in the Sprocketeer group, largest independent community of HubSpot admin, here to help one another. And then make sure you check out our friends Kyle Jepson and Deanna Goloff. They host the HubSpot Admin HubSpot User Group, Tuesdays, 10 a.m. Central Time. Links to all of the above are in the show notes. And if you are watching this live or watching it on YouTube, make sure you check it out on Spotify and vice versa. All of our episodes are edited and on Spotify and YouTube. Thank you all for joining, and Sprocket on.
Bye, everybody.